The screaming started when she held out her hand. 3 Vorath cubs stood in the wreckage of residential barracks Tier 3, and every expert on 6 open channels was losing their mind at once. The cubs were the most dangerous juvenile predators in known space. The human between them and the command team had a cleaning cart and a work order for a mess in Sector 3, and she was reaching out her open palm toward the lead cub's face like it was the most natural thing she'd ever done. No warning given, no shot fired, no protocol followed. Pelix Oron, station warden of Academy Outpost Verath 9, watched this happen on his security feed. His secondary left arm had folded itself so tight against his thorax that he could feel his own pulse in it. His communications officer had stopped pretending not to notice. The cub leaned forward. Its inner mandibles parted, 4 rows of edges that the Accord's own texts described as capable of cutting through reinforced hull plating. 6 eyes, all 6, fixed on the human's open hand. Pelix stopped breathing. Then the cub pressed its snout into her palm. The sound that came out of it was not in any database on the station. The translators cycled through 17 attempts and gave up. It was soft, low. It was the kind of sound that made the hair rise on the back of Pelix's neck for reasons he couldn't name and didn't have time to think about, because Station Warden Pelix Oron's legs had just stopped working. He sat down on the floor of the command tier. He did not plan to. His legs simply stopped, and the floor was there, and that was that. His communications officer looked at him. He looked at his communications officer. Across 3 open fleet channels, nobody said a single word. That part comes in about 12 minutes. Stay close. 4 hours earlier, Verath 9 had been a normal Tuesday. Or rather, it had been close to a normal Tuesday. The station ran at about 80% of what the Accord considered optimal staffing, which meant that 80% of things worked correctly, and the remaining 20% depended on who was on shift and how determined they were. The lower decks smelled of recycled air and industrial cleaner. The cadets in Barracks Tier 3 were doing whatever cadets did on a Tuesday afternoon, which mostly meant arguing about the food in the commissary and losing things. The Vorath cubs were in diplomatic holding Suite Amber 7. That was where they were supposed to be. The suite had been retrofitted 6 weeks in advance of their arrival, at significant expense, with materials rated to withstand a Vorath adult in a bad mood. The temperature was calibrated to their home-world specifications. The light cycle matched Vorath biological rhythms. 3 different species of enrichment objects had been sourced and approved by the Accord's Xenobiology Division. The environmental logs for Amber 7 would later show something that nobody on Verath 9 had thought to check. But that comes later. First, the cleaning cart. Marin Osk was pushing it down Corridor 7G when the evacuation alert went out. The cart had a squeaky wheel, the front left. A small grinding complaint that she'd been meaning to fix for about 6 weeks and kept not getting around to. She had an earbud in her right ear, some kind of low-rhythm music that her coworkers described as baffling, and a data pad balanced on the cart's edge with her afternoon work orders pulled up. The evacuation alert blared through every speaker on the lower decks. Marin reached up and pulled out one earbud. She looked at the speakers, then at her data pad, then at the work order at the top of her queue, which read, Barracks Tier 3, Cadet Residential Level, Report of Significant Mess, Cause Unknown. She tucked the earbud back in. She kept pushing the cart. 3 minutes later, Pelix's communications officer flagged a maintenance response to the evacuation broadcast. Pelix pulled it up. It read, Cannot evacuate, active work order, sector contamination risk, refer to Maintenance Protocol 7-4B. Technically correct, procedurally bulletproof. He stared at it for a moment, then stared at the secondary security feed showing a small human woman pushing a cart with a squeaky wheel toward the most dangerous active situation on the station. He did not yet know her name. He would know it very well by the end of the day. The Vorath cubs had arrived 11 days ago aboard a Sovereignty escort vessel, which had required the station's docking bay to be cleared of all other traffic, and 3 different Accord diplomatic teams to stand in a formal receiving line in their best uniforms. The cubs were juveniles. The diplomatic paperwork was very clear on this point, which in Vorath terms meant they were roughly waist height on a human adult, 6-limbed, covered in obsidian scales that caught the light like wet stone, with 6 eyes apiece and dorsal ridges that shifted color based on their emotional state. They were, the paperwork also noted, the offspring of the Vorath Empress herself. 3 previous negotiations between the Accord and the Vorath sovereignty had collapsed. The reasons were various and complicated, and mostly came down to the fact that the Vorath read every form of careful diplomatic positioning as a threat display, which made careful diplomatic positioning somewhat counterproductive. The Cubs' visit was the first gesture of actual goodwill in a decade. The idea was that shared space, positive association, the simple fact of being in the same place without anyone getting hurt, these things might build something that formal talks had failed to build. One dead Cub meant war. Not metaphorically, literally. The sovereignty had treaty obligations with 17 allied systems, and those systems had treaty obligations with 11 others. And the math of what happened if a Vorath imperial offspring died on an Accord station was the kind of math that kept fleet admirals awake at night. Pellix had a laminated card on his desk with the number on it. He'd made it himself 2 weeks before the Cubs arrived. He looked at it sometimes in the morning while his station drink was cooling. He looked at it now. The number had not changed. The situation had. 3 Cubs loose in Tier 3. His communications officer, a young Trilathi named Vess, read from her console with the specific tone of someone who was reporting facts and refusing to assign meaning to them until ordered to do so. Containment breach logged at 1407. Tranquilizer deployment attempted at 1409. No measurable effect. None. The lead Cub caught the delivery unit, Vess said, and gave it to one of the others. Pellix's secondary arm began to move toward his thorax. Sonic deterrence. Activated at 1411, Vess paused. The Cubs appear to find it interesting. The secondary arm finished its journey. It pressed flat against his side. Fleet Command is on Channel 3, Vess added. They've been on Channel 3 for 8 minutes. They would like a status update. Tell them the status is ongoing. I told them that 6 minutes ago. Tell them it's still ongoing. On the main security feed, Pellix pulled up Barracks Tier 3. The cadets had barricaded themselves into the back 2 rooms, which was the correct response per protocol. The corridor outside was a different situation. Lockers had been torn open, not forced, torn, the hinges left as bent metal suggestions of their former purpose. Uniforms, data pads, personal effects, and what appeared to be a cadet's entire collection of printed photographs were scattered across the floor. One of the Cubs was carrying a dress uniform in its mandibles, like a very large, very sharp-toothed cat with a bird. The tranquilizers had done nothing. The sonic barriers had done less. The riot shields were now toys. Pellix opened Channel 2. Security Chief, what's your current status? 3 of my best people are in the medical bay, came the response. Lacerations, not life-threatening. The Cubs weren't trying to hurt them, they were playing. That's not a comfort, that's just context. A pause. The 4th officer is watching the Cubs from a distance. She says, and I am quoting directly, sir, that they seem to be getting bored of what they have. Getting bored? Yes, sir. Of the riot equipment? Yes, sir. Pellix looked at the secondary feed. Marin Osk and her squeaky cart had reached the junction outside Tier 3. She stopped, checked her data pad, then pushed the cart around the corner toward the barracks entrance. He opened every channel at once. Human. Stop, code Apex in progress. Evacuate immediately. Marin pulled out one earbud. She looked at the speaker on the wall, then at the barracks door, then back at the speaker. What's all the noise about? She said. I've got a work order for Tier 3. Apparently someone made a mess. Human. Pellix could hear something happening in his own voice that he didn't care for. There are Vorath Predator Cubs inside that room. They have injured 3 security officers. All containment protocols have failed. You need to leave this area immediately. Marin considered this for a moment. She said. She pushed the cart through the door. Pellix's communications officer made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was the kind of sound you make when you see something happen, and your brain hasn't finished deciding how to feel about it. On the security feed, all 3 Vorath Cubs emerged from the shadows at the far end of the barracks. They moved in what the Accord's Xenobiology Division described as a coordinated approach pattern, 6 legs each, perfectly synchronized, obsidian scales picking up the corridor, lighting in shifting bands of black and deep green. Their dorsal ridges were raised. The color at the tips was a deep, warning red. Their mandibles moved in a specific rhythm that the Accord's behavioral index had a full entry for, which Pellix had read twice in the past 8 minutes. Pre-pounce click sequence. Escalating rate indicates increasing strike probability. All 18 eyes fixed on Marin Osk. Marin looked back at them. Then she looked at the scattered belongings on the floor. Her eyes moved over the torn lockers, the dragged uniforms, the personal effects distributed across roughly 40 square meters of corridor. Oh, hey, she said, in the tone of someone who had found exactly what they expected to find. You 3 did all this. Pellix's secondary arm reached a new level of compression against his thorax that he hadn't previously achieved. Fleet Command on Channel 3, Vess said quietly. They're asking why you haven't responded. Patch and Dr. Vreth on, Pellix said. The xenobiologist. He's on the station for the academic exchange. Get him now. Already flagged him, sir. He's connecting. The secondary feed showed Marin pulling her data pad off the cart and looking at her work order with mild interest. The Cubs had tightened their circle. The pre-pounce click rate had increased. Vrethon's image appeared on the tertiary screen. He was a Draven academic, which meant he was old in a way that showed in his coloring pale silver scales where younger Draven ran darker, and he had 3 eyes, all of them currently directed at the security feed Pelix had sent him with the urgency flag. The bioluminescent flush at the edges of his scales was running a faint, anxious gold. "Warden," he said, "I've reviewed the feed. What you're seeing is consistent with a terminal approach sequence. The click rate indicates the Cubs are approximately 8 to 12 seconds from." "She's not moving," Pelix said. "I can see that. She needs to move. She doesn't appear to be planning to." A pause. Vrethon's scales cycled a slightly brighter gold. "I should explain," he said, in the careful voice of someone who had written 600 pages on a subject, and was now watching that subject behave in a way that wasn't in any of them. That Vorath neurological architecture, specifically the predatory cortex, prevents the formation of compliance responses outside their immediate genetic unit. Once a coordinated approach sequence is initiated, it cannot be. "Warden," Vess's voice cut through. "The human just made a sound." Pelix looked at the feed. Marin had looked up from her data pad. She was looking at the lead Cub, and she had cleared her throat. It was a short sound, sharp, the kind of sound that means that is enough and I am the one saying so. The lead Cub stopped. All 3 Cubs stopped. 18 eyes swiveled to Marin Osk. The sound lasted less than a second. The silence it made lasted considerably longer. Pelix watched his feed without breathing. On his secondary arm, he could feel his own pulse. "Dr. On," he said very carefully. "Yes," Vrethon said. He sounded like a man looking at his own research notes and finding that someone had replaced all the words. "They stopped. I can see that. You said they couldn't stop." "I said they couldn't stop. Yes, I am aware of what I said." The Cubs had not moved. Their dorsal ridges were still raised, but the color at the tips had shifted, the deep warning red bleeding out into something closer to amber. All 18 eyes remained on Marin, who had put her data pad back on the cart, and was now looking at the 3 apex predators in front of her with the expression of someone taking stock of a medium-sized problem. "Did you 3 do all this?" she said again. Her voice was the same as before, not louder, not softer, just steady. The lead Cub tilted its head. "Dr. On," Pelix said, "I am watching. How long have they been still?" A pause, 31 seconds. "Is there a record of a Vorath coordinated approach, stopping at 31 seconds into the sequence?" Another pause, longer. "No," Vrethon said. Gunax Drell's credentials had arrived in Pelix's message queue 40 minutes before the breach, which in retrospect felt pointed. He was certified by the Accord's Emergency Response Division to handle predator species across 47 documented categories, with a secondary certification in alien apex fauna and a tertiary in crisis de-escalation. He had 11 certification medallions, each one etched with the name of a species he had successfully managed. Managed being the Accord's polite word for made submit to authority through dominance display, chemical suppression, or physical containment. The medallions were welded directly to his chest plate. He did not remove them. He smelled faintly of synthetic pheromone compounds even when he was just walking down a corridor, which was either a side effect of the certification process or a choice, and Pelix had never been certain which. He was 2.8 meters tall. His stance took up nearly the full width of a standard Accord corridor. He moved with the careful, deliberate pace of something that had never once, in its entire adult life, needed to hurry. He had a 99.4% success rate across 53 species. Pelix had pulled that number from the file and held onto it in the way you hold onto something when the thing you're actually holding onto isn't available. It was a good number. It was a reassuring number. What the number did not say, what was not immediately visible unless you scrolled to the bottom of the file and found the methodology footnote in .6 font, was coming. But that comes later, too. Right now, Marin Osk was crouching down to look at a scattered pile of cadet belongings, and the 3 most dangerous juveniles in known space were watching her do it. "Did you take all this stuff?" she said, in the same tone she might use to ask whether someone had finished the last of the cold storage units on the break room shelf. She picked up a uniform shirt, looked at it, set it back down. "This came out of those lockers." The lead Cub made a sound, not the pre-pounce click, something else. The translator on Pelix's console tried it and returned. "Unknown vocalization, no match in database." Marin looked at the cub. The cub looked at Marin. "Uh-huh," Marin said. She stood up and reached into the breast pocket of her coverall. Pelix saw her pull out a small rectangle, yellowed paper in cracked laminate, edges soft and curved from years of being folded and pulled and folded again. She looked at it for a moment, then put it back. On his feed, at the angle of the corridor camera, Pelix had just barely caught the top line. It said, "Find out what they actually need." She already knew what it said. She'd looked at it for less than 2 seconds and put it back because she already knew. The looking was just a habit, the kind of thing you do when you've carried something long enough that checking it is just part of how you move through the world. "Okay," Marin said to the 3 apex predators in front of her. "So here's the thing." Pelix opened his mouth, then closed it. He had 17 escalation protocols available to him. Not one of them had a section for this. "They've been still for 47 seconds. Vess said it quietly, like she was reporting something fragile. "I know. Sir, the Accord Xenobiological Database has no recorded instance of a Vorath coordinated approach sequence, stopping voluntarily at the 47-second mark." "I know, Vess. It has no recorded instance of one stopping at any mark." "I know." Vrethon's bioluminescence had shifted from anxious gold to something closer to pale yellow. On the Draven scale of physiological stress responses, pale yellow was the color a Draven academic scales went when the evidence in front of them was in direct conflict with 4 decades of published research. He hadn't said anything in 90 seconds. The cubs were circling Marin now, but not the way they had been. The tight, synchronized threat circle had loosened into something less precise. The smallest cub had drifted slightly out of alignment with the other 2. Its dorsal ridge was still raised, but the color at the tips had gone from amber to a dull orange, which the behavioral index listed as low arousal attention state. "They're not hunting," Pelix said, mostly to himself. "No," Vrethon said, and then very quietly, as if the words cost him something, "They appear to be watching her." Fleet Command had been on Channel 3 for 22 minutes. Fleet Admiral Surath 7 voice, when it came through, was the voice of someone who had survived 17 military campaigns and was currently experiencing a new category of situation. "Warden Oren, situation update, now. The cubs are calm, Admiral. The human maintenance worker who entered the barracks appears to have stopped the coordinated approach sequence." A long silence. "She did what?" "Stopped the approach sequence." "How?" Pelix looked at the feed. Marin was pointing at a specific spot on the floor, saying something he couldn't quite hear. "She cleared her throat at them," he said. The silence on the Admiral's end spoke several volumes. "Has anyone?" Marin's voice came through the barracks comm as she apparently found the panel and activated it without being asked. "Tried just talking to them, like calmly? Has that been on the list of things we've tried?" Fleet Admiral Surath 7-4 arms shifted position on the holographic feed. "Human, you are in an active Code Apex situation. Please stand by for extraction." "I'm okay, thanks. I'm just asking because they seem to be listening. They've been listening since I got here, so I'm wondering if maybe everyone's been sort of." She paused. Yelling. Another silence. Then, from Vrethon, "Empirically, yes." Marin nodded like this confirmed something she'd suspected. "Okay, so just a thought. What if we didn't do that?" Pelix pressed his secondary arm harder against his thorax. It was the 11th minute. His communications officer had long since given up pretending not to track how long the arm had been tucked. The smallest cub had sat down. Not crouched, not lowered itself into a strike position. Sat down the way a young thing sits when it is watching something that interests it, and it has decided to watch rather than move. Its dorsal ridge was still partly raised, but the color at the tips had gone to a soft, dull gold. "Dr. On," Pelix said. "Yes." The smallest cub just sat down. "I see it. Is that in the database?" Vrethon's scales had gone fully pale, not anxious gold. Pale, the color of a Draven academic whose physiological stress response had moved past gold and through several other colors and come out the other side into something that the Accord Medical Database classified as acute cognitive shock. "No," he said, "that is not in the database. She calls overturning 4 decades of xenobiology counting." That was from Vrethon's private log, recovered later. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was the kind of sentence you write when you need to put something somewhere outside your own head. "I have never hated a sentence more." On the barracks feed, Marin Osk had her hands on her hips. "You can give back what you took," she said to the 3 cubs in front of her, in the tone of someone presenting a simple and obvious set of options to a person who had temporarily forgotten they existed. "Or I can call your parents. Those are the choices." What's it going to be? The lead cub's dorsal ridge drooped by 2 centimeters. Pelix's mouth opened. The lead cub's dorsal ridge had drooped. The Vorath Behavioral Index did not have an entry for that. There was no entry because nobody had ever observed it, because the behavioral index was based on 600 years of observation, and in 600 years, nobody had ever said those words to a Vorath cub and gotten a response that looked like that. She's a vest stopped. Yes, Pelix said. She's going to put them in a corner. Yes. That's not a recognized containment protocol. No. Marin pointed to a clear section of the corridor floor just to her left. You 3, over there, sit and think about it. The cubs looked at each other. This was, in itself, remarkable. The Accord had 17 documented Vorath group behavior patterns, and none of them included what the cubs did next, which was exchange a look, an actual coordinated glance, the kind that implies communication, the kind that says, "Are we going to do this?" and then shuffle one by one to the spot Marin had indicated and sit down in a row. A row. 3 obsidian-scaled, 6-limbed, 6-eyed Galaxy Apex Predator cubs, sitting in a neat row on the floor of Residential Barracks Tier 3, looking at a sanitation technician. She put Apex Predators in a corner, Pelix said. Gunnax Drell, who had been standing in the doorway for the past 6 minutes with his throat sac deflated and his spinal ridge half lowered, said, "That is not a recognized." "It's working," Pelix said. Gunnax did not have a response to this. 1703. Gunnax Drell was still standing in the doorway. He had been standing there for 6 minutes, which was how long it had taken the 3 most dangerous juveniles in known space to shuffle across a corridor floor and sit in a row at the direction of a sanitation technician. His throat sac, which he deployed at the start of every Predator engagement as the first phase of the dominance sequence that had earned him 11 medallions and a 99.4% success rate, had deflated somewhere around the 2nd minute and not reinflated. His spinal ridge, which was supposed to be fully raised for maximum visual impact during the dominance phase, was at about 60%. The synthetic pheromone compounds, which were calibrated to signal apex authority to dominance-responsive species across 47 documented categories, were doing absolutely nothing. The cubs were not looking at him. They had looked at him briefly when he'd filled the doorway. Their dorsal ridges had ticked a 1/4 inch in his direction. The Vorath Behavioral Index called this a low arousal orientation response, which translated plainly as, "We noticed you exist," and then ticked back. All 18 eyes had returned to Marin Osk, who was picking up a cadet's scattered personal effects and stacking them in a pile near the wall. The 11 medallions on Gunnax Drell's chest plate were very still. "Mr. Drell," Pelix said on the private channel, "your assessment." A long pause. "The methodology," Gunnax said, "is not recognized. The methodology is working." Another pause, longer. "The methodology," he said again, and then he didn't finish the sentence because there wasn't a way to finish it that led somewhere he wanted to go. On the feed, the lead cub had shifted its weight, not toward Gunnax, toward Marin, who had moved 3 meters to her left to pick up a torn photograph. The cub tracked her the way a cat tracks a sunbeam, purely, with no threat in it at all. Vrethon had not spoken in 4 minutes. His bioluminescence was fully dark. No gold, no pale yellow. Just dark, the scales flat and color-free in a way that looked, on Pelix's security feed, almost wrong, like a light that had been switched off inside him. The Accord medical database had a classification for total bioluminescent shutdown in Draven specialists, and Pelix's communications officer had looked it up without being asked and put the entry in the corner of his main screen where he could see it. Acute cognitive shock. Onset, exposure to evidence incompatible with core framework. Duration, variable. Recommended response, rest and reduced stimulation. Vrethon had 6 decades of published research. He had written the textbook on Vorath neurological architecture. Literally, the textbook, the one the Accord's diplomatic teams were issued on first contact with a Vorath delegation. He had 4 papers in the current edition of the Accord Xenobiology Review. He had testified before the Joint Science Commission 11 times. His body had looked at a sanitation technician, putting 3 apex predators in a corner, and decided that was an injury. "Dr. On," Pelix said quietly. "Yes." "How many of the Accord's current predator response protocols are based on your research?" A very long pause. "Most of them," Vrethon said. Pelix did not respond to this. There wasn't a response for it. He looked at the feed. Marin was talking to the cubs again, low and easy, in the tone of someone explaining something that should have been obvious to everyone a while ago. The open loop sitting in the back of Pelix's mind was this. If Vrethon's framework was wrong, not incomplete, not limited, but structurally wrong in a way that had just caused a Draven specialist's bioluminescence to go dark, then every protocol built on it was wrong too. Not wrong in a fixable way. Wrong in the way that means you have to go back to the beginning and ask different questions. Pelix did not say this out loud. He filed it in the part of his mind reserved for things that would need to be said later, at length, in a very long report. Right now, the Cubs were still sitting in a row. Warden, Vess's voice was careful. Fleet Admiral Surath 7, Channel 3. Put her through. Surath 7 image filled the screen. She had the broad, flat-featured face of a Keth senior officer, 4 arms folded in the command tier configuration, her rank insignia precise and unsmudged. She had run 17 campaigns. She had the voice of someone who had, in those campaigns, authorized things she didn't enjoy authorizing and done it anyway, because someone had to. Situation, she said. The Cubs are calm and seated, Admiral. No injuries beyond the initial security response. The human maintenance worker has established a degree of... Pelix paused. He searched for the right word in the Accord's operational vocabulary and could not find it. Rapport. Rapport. Yes, Admiral. With the Vorath Cubs. Yes. The Vorath Cubs who are rated, Admiral Surath 7 said, in the tone of someone reading from a very authoritative document, as the most dangerous juvenile predators in the known Accord, whose instinctive threat response overrides all voluntary social modulation, whose neurological architecture has been confirmed by 6 decades of xenobiological research to be incapable of. Yes, Admiral, those Cubs. Surath 7 looked at the feed Pelix had patched to her. She looked at it for a long time. Marin was crouching down to pick up something from under a bunk. The lead Cub had leaned forward slightly, dorsal ridge at a low, calm orange. It was watching her the way something watches a thing it has decided it likes. She cleared her throat at them, Surath 7 said. In round 2, yes. Currently, she's told them to think about what they've done. Fleet Admiral Surath 7, veteran of 17 campaigns, was quiet for a moment. Authorize lethal force, she said. I want options ready. Admirals. Ready, Warden, not deployed. I want the option available if the situation changes. One dead Cub ends the peace. I will not have that happen. Pelix looked at the feed. The smallest Cub had inched slightly closer to Marin's cleaning cart and was sniffing the wheel. Understood, Admiral. He pulled up the lethal force authorization panel on his secondary console. His secondary arm had been tucked against his thorax for 11 minutes. The communications officer had given up tracking it and was now just watching the feed. Vrethon had the research. Gunnax Drell had the credentials. The Admiral had the fleet. Marin had a mop and a laminated list. Marin, on the barracks feed, had apparently found the comm panel again. Has anyone tried asking them to give the stuff back? Her voice came through the open channel with no particular inflection. Not dramatic, just genuinely curious, the way you ask a question when you've been wondering about it for a while and have decided it's reasonable to ask. Like directly, has that happened? 3 channels went quiet at once. Human, said Fleet Admiral Surath 7, very precisely. We have a 99.4% certified specialist on scene. We have xenobiological expertise on active consult. We have fleet authorization for graduated force. The situation is being handled by trained. I get that, Marin said. I'm just asking if anyone's asked them. A longer silence. Then from Vrethon very quietly. Empirically, yes. No, nobody has asked them. Marin nodded like this confirmed it. Okay, she said to the Cubs. Hey, you 3. All 18 eyes. Can you give that stuff back? The things you took from the lockers. She pointed at the pile near the wall, uniforms, data pads, the photograph, a cadet's toolkit. Just put it back over there. The lead Cub looked at the pile. It looked at Marin. It looked at the second Cub. The second Cub looked at the third Cub. The third Cub had been investigating the cleaning cart's wheel and had to be looked at twice before it noticed. Then it looked at the pile. One by one, they began moving things. Not quickly, not with any visible urgency, but deliberately, one item at a time, carried in mandibles that could cut through hull plating, set down with a care that didn't seem to fit anything the Accord had on record. The lead Cub brought back a data pad. The second Cub dragged a uniform. The third Cub picked up the photograph, the printed one, the personal one, the kind of thing that wouldn't survive mandible contact, and carried it across the floor without a mark on it and set it in the pile. Pelix's secondary arm was still. He hadn't noticed when it had stopped pressing against his thorax. He noticed now. Warden, Vess said. She sounded like someone waking up slowly. The Admiral's weapons authorization. Hold it. Sir. Hold it, Vess. On his secondary feed, a status update was blinking. He had not looked at it yet. He looked at it now. VORETH Sovereignty Escort Vessel, DOCKING approach confirmed. ETA 14 minutes. Weapons status hot. The Empress's ship. Nobody had told the Empress what was happening. She had been in transit since the breach was logged, which meant she had been traveling toward Verath 9 for the past 40 minutes with weapons charged and a 14-minute countdown to arrival. And nobody had sent her a status update because nobody had known what the status was. Pelix looked at the feed. Marin was examining the returned items one by one, checking each one like she was counting inventory. The lead cub was sitting close enough to her that its dorsal ridge was almost touching her shoulder. 14 minutes. He opened his mouth to tell Vess to hail the Sovereignty vessel. Then he looked at the feed again. The cub's dorsal ridge had just touched Marin's shoulder. Not a threat display, not a territorial press, just contact, the way something makes contact when it has decided the other thing is safe. Pelix closed his mouth. "Get me the environmental logs for diplomatic holding Sweet Amber 7, he said instead. All 6 hours before the breach. Vess pulled them up. She read them. She went quiet. "Sir," she said, "the distress signals." "Tell me." Amber 7 logged behavioral distress signals, starting 6 hours before the breach. Standard pattern, repeated vocalizations, increased movement, attempt to reach the door. She paused. The system flagged them for review. The review was queued. It was the last item in an 18-item queue. Pelix thought about the cooling drink on his desk. The laminated card, the number. "They were asking for help," he said. "For 6 hours," Vess said, and then they found a way to ask louder. The Empress's ship was 13 minutes out. Weapons hot. No briefing received. Pelix looked at the feed. Marin had finished the inventory count. She straightened up, brushed a smear of cleaning compound off her wrist, and shifted her weight back on her heels. The posture of someone settling in, not bracing. She looked at the 3 cubs in front of her the way you look at something when you've figured out what the actual problem was. And it turned out to be simpler than everyone thought. "You were bored," she said. It wasn't a question. The lead cub made a sound. The translator cycled. Unknown vocalization, no match in database. "You needed something to do," Marin said, "and something to do it with. 12 minutes. She crouched down, hands on knees, weight forward, dropping herself to eye level with the lead cub. The cub did not back away. Its dorsal ridge had gone fully warm orange, which the behavioral index listed somewhere between alert and calm, a color the index had never had cause to apply to a human interaction. Marin held her hand out, palm down, fingers loose. The way you hold your hand when you're not grabbing, not threatening, not asking for anything, just offering the fact of it. The cub went still. Not the threat stillness, the coiled readiness that had preceded the approach sequence. A different kind of still, the stillness of something deciding. The second and third cubs had stopped moving. All 18 eyes were on the hand. Across 3 open channels, 6 experts had things to say. They said them. The channels filled up with opinions and warnings and protocol citations, and the voice of Fleet Admiral Surath 7 saying the word human in a tone that carried the full weight of 17 campaigns. Marin did not react to any of it. She waited. The cub leaned, the cub sniffed. The cub pressed its snout into her open palm and made a sound the galaxy had never heard before. It was soft, low. It was not a threat display, and it was not a distress call, and it was not any of the 42 documented Vorith juvenile vocalizations. The translators on Pelix's console cycled through the database 3 times and came back empty each time, and on the 4th attempt produced something that wasn't a translation so much as a category. Infant attachment vocalization. Outside recorded parameters. No prior instance ON file. Never recorded outside a family unit. Vrethon made a sound, not words. Just a sound, short and sharp, like something had hit him somewhere that wasn't physical. Fleet Admiral Surath 7 said very quietly, "All science teams, please confirm you are recording." On the feed, Pelix watched the lead cub press its snout more firmly into Marin's palm. Watched the second cub inch forward. Watched Marin's hand hold steady, not pulling back, not gripping, just there. He felt his legs stop. He sat down on the floor of the command tier. The same floor he'd sat on once already today, for different reasons, which felt like a long time ago. He sat down, and he did not plan to, and he did not get back up, because his legs had made a decision, and he agreed with it. His communications officer looked at him. He looked at his communications officer. Neither of them said anything. The Empress's ship was 9 minutes out. Nobody had briefed her. Her weapons were still hot. She was about to walk through a door into a room where her cubs were pressing their faces into a human maintenance worker's hand. and making a sound that the translators had no category for, and nobody had told her any of it. Pelix looked at his console. He looked at the hail button for the sovereignty vessel. He looked at the feed. He did not press the button. Let her see it herself, he thought. Let her see what it looks like when someone just pays attention. It took the Empress 7 minutes to dock and 3 minutes to reach Barracks Tier 3, which put her at the doorway at minute 10. She was larger than her cubs in the way that Vorath adults were larger, not just size but presence, the kind of presence that changes the pressure in a room. Her dorsal ridges were full raised. Her mandibles were showing all 4 rows. She had come in weapons hot and in a state that the diplomatic corps would later describe, in careful language, as ready for any outcome. She stopped in the doorway. Her 3 cubs were competing for a human's hands. The lead cub had both front limbs on Marin's knees. The second had its snout under her left palm. The third was pressing against her side with the full weight of its obsidian-scaled shoulder, and Marin was sitting cross-legged on the corridor floor of Barracks Tier 3, talking to all 3 of them in the low, steady voice of someone with no plans to be anywhere else for a while. The Empress's dorsal ridges stayed, raised for a long moment. Then slowly they lowered. "What," said the Empress in translated Accord Standard, "are you?" Marin looked up. She took in the Empress, the raised ridges, the mandibles, the full raised presence of an apex predator and a sovereign and a mother all at once. And her expression did not change. "Sanitation technician," she said. "Ma'am." The Empress looked at her cubs. The lead cub made the sound again, the soft, low one, the one with no database entry, and pressed its snout back into Marin's palm. The Empress was quiet for a long time. "They were asking for help," Marin said. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't explaining. She was just saying it, the way you say a fact to someone who needs to know it. The environmental logs show 6 hours of distress signals before they got out. They needed attention and something to do. Kids do. She glanced at the returned pile of cadet belongings. "We sorted it out." The Empress looked at the pile, looked at her cubs, looked at Marin. "You returned everything," the Empress said. "They did," Marin said. "I just asked." In the command tier, Pelix was still on the floor. Vrethon's bioluminescence had not returned. Gunax Drell was somewhere in the corridor behind the Empress, very quiet, very still, the 11 medallions on his chest plate not making a sound. Fleet Admiral Surath's 7 voice came through on Channel 3, level and clear. "All science teams, someone find out what else humans do that we haven't noticed." Marin walked the cubs to Diplomatic holding Sweet Amber 7, which took 9 minutes because the cubs kept stopping to investigate things, and she kept waiting for them without hurrying anyone along. She narrated the route the way you narrate things to something young that is paying attention. Here's the junction, here's the lift, here's the corridor that turns left, this is the panel that opens the door. The cubs followed without a single documented flight behavior, not one. Vrethon wrote his retraction that evening. He wrote it 3 times before he could submit it, because submitting it meant saying, in formal language, in a document that would go into the Accord's permanent scientific record, that a sanitation technician had done in 10 minutes what his field had not done in 6 centuries. The 3rd draft was the shortest. It was also the most accurate. He submitted that one. Gunax Drell stood in the corridor for several minutes after the cubs, and Marin and the Empress had gone. The medallions on his chest plate did not move. He was not reading anything or talking to anyone. He was standing in a corridor that smelled faintly of synthetic pheromone compounds that had done nothing, looking at the spot on the floor where 3 cubs had sat in a row when asked. He took a 6-month sabbatical, which the formal record noted in a single line. The Vorath Protocol was amended in 17 places. The amendment process took 4 weeks, which was fast for an Accord protocol revision, and the new framework had a section that had not previously existed, titled simply, Environmental Needs Assessment, mandatory prior to any escalation response. The section was 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph began, consult human personnel before escalation. Consult human personnel before threat assessment. Consult human personnel before assuming the situation is without solution. Someone in the Accord's communications division printed copies of Marin's laminated list, the original text plus the fresh ink edition at the bottom. This outperformed 6 centuries of protocol and pinned them to every emergency response station on Varath 9 in 14 languages. The laminate was new. The edges were clean and straight. Pelix filed his report at the end of the shift. He wrote it the same way he wrote every report, which was clearly and in order because that was how reports were supposed to be written. The last line read, "The human was not extraordinary, she was simply paying attention." He filed it, he stood up from his desk. He went to find out what the Vorath cubs needed for breakfast. Down on the lower decks, The corridor outside Barracks Tier 3 was empty. The cadets had come out of the back rooms and gone to the commissary. The scattered belongings had been returned and put away. The lockers had been propped shut with a workaround that someone would need to actually fix tomorrow. Marin Osk's cleaning cart was at the far end of the corridor, parked where she'd left it when she went to walk the cubs back. The squeaky wheel made one sound in the empty air, as the ventilation system moved through the corridor. Then it was quiet,